Spooky, scary skeletons and shivers down your spine. Shrieking skulls will shock your soul, seal your doom tonight.
Horror as a genre has a weird niche among film communities. Horror films have this intrinsic feedback loop between them. Genres are just a set of expectations that the audience has for the films, but more than other genres, horror audiences do not give as much wiggle room. This is why every famous horror movie has a gross amount of copy and paste sequels. But these sequels still do pretty well and are integral to the representation of these characters in media. Horror fans have these expectations, and often don't enjoy when the genre strays from those expectations. While this is all true, the explosion of the horror genre in the 70s and 80s led to the genre becoming stale by the 90s. Then in 1996, Scream is released, and in 2013, Cabin in the Woods is released, and they both killed the horror genre, causing it to be revitalized. Firstly, let's define some terms. Metatextuality is when a piece of text, in this case a movie, makes commentary on either itself or other pieces of similar text. Some obvious examples of metatextuality are breaking the fourth wall. Deadpool is a metatextual response to the superhero genre. Intertextuality is similar to metatextuality. Intertextuality is essentially when a text refers to another text, but it does not have to be critical like metatextuality. A simple reference is intertextuality. Satire is often conflated with comedy. While the two can, and often do, overlap, they are not one and the same. Scream and Cabin in the Woods both use satire incredibly well to metatextually commentate on the tropes of the horror genre. While they do have humorous moments, no doubt, they are not comedies through and through. So let's talk about them. Scream is the story of the murderous Ghostface who has been terrorizing this town. It is a slasher through and through, but also mixes in other genres such as a mystery whodunit. But the main aspect of Scream is its self-reflexive nature. The movie is incredibly self-aware that it is a horror movie. Horror movies exist in the world, and the characters themselves talk about horror movies and their tropes. Cabin in the Woods, on the other hand, is a story of a group of friends that, you guessed it, go to a cabin in the woods. However, there is an organization that is manufacturing the horror events of the film. At the end, you discover that the organization has to constantly manufacture these events in order to please the Ancient Ones. The ways that this organization puppeteers the events commentates on how horror characters make poor decisions and tend to always fit into neat archetypes. Cabin in the Woods, in theory, could explain the existence of almost every horror movie of the past. It intertextually references other films like Hellraiser as options for other villains. Cabin in the Woods, while obviously a horror movie, doesn't fit neatly into a specific subgenre. This is the key difference between the roles that these two films play in the horror genre. Scream is a satire of slashers, while also being a good slasher in its own right. One of the largest critiques that Cabin in the Woods gives the horror genre is the genre's obsession with archetypal characters. At the end of the film, we see that each of the characters fit a specific archetype common in horror movies. Jules is the whore, Kurt is the athlete, Marty is the fool, Holden is the scholar, and Dana is the virgin. These are the tight genre expectations that horror films have of the characters in their films. The fabrication of the events is not just the setting that they put the characters in, but also the forced assimilation into these archetypes. We meet the characters in the beginning, and they seem as if, on the surface, they fit these archetypes, but we actually learn that they don't. Kurt, for example, is the athlete. Chris Hemsworth, on the surface, feels like an obvious athlete. The film commentates on the surface level reading because Kurt isn't actually the stereotypical athlete when delves into more deeply. We see this subversion early in the film when Dana first meets Kurt, and Kurt recommends a different book for her to read, showing that he isn't just a dumb jock. Later in the film, we see how the men in the control room have to use pheromones and gases to shape his behaviors because the actual fully realized person that Kurt is doesn't fit into the needed characteristics of the athlete in horror films. Marty commentates on this, pointing out that he has a full ride through college majoring in sociology, not something we'd generally associate with the jock. Likewise, the character of Jules dyes her hair blonde, but we later find out in the film that the hair dyes had something put into it to lower brain functioning through the scalp. Similar to Kurt, Jules is a much more well-rounded person outside of the confines of the movie, but the archetype has to be fabricated. The characters of Steve and Gary act as horror filmmakers, fabricating the events of the movie in order to please the omniscient Ancient Ones, which take the place of the horror viewers. The Ancient Ones, like the audience, have strict expectations that horror films have to conform to. These concepts are extremely metatextual in that they are part of the film that represents the genre as a whole and the audience themselves. This film gets as close to breaking the fourth wall as possible without actually breaking it. You can tell when a genre is fading when the films begin becoming self-reflexive, and that will either kill the genre or force the genre to adapt and change. Cabin in the Woods is exactly that role for horror films. The Ancient Ones act as the audience and how the audience would react if the genre changed past what they expected. The Ancient Ones don't destroy the world that we live in, they destroy the worlds of the horror films of the past. The genre was stagnating, showing only cookie-cutter archetypal characters that the audience expected. Cabin in the Woods, both through text and metatext, shows the destruction of the horror genre and implies the reconstruction of the genre without that stagnation. In the film, there's a line where Steve says, "Don't you remember when we could just throw a woman in a volcano?" implying that the rules of the Ancient Ones have changed and evolved over time. This is showing the horror genre itself has evolved in a contradictory way to a breaking point. The horror genre has evolved just from throwing someone into a volcano into tightly knit expectations of archetypes. The genre has evolved, but when the genre is stuck in such strict guidelines, the genre will eventually break. Scream, on the opposite hand, is self-reflexive by being part of the genre that it is criticizing more heavily. Scream works as a slasher, with Ghostface filling the same role as other classic horror characters like Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees. The film employs metatext not through the plot like Cabin in the Woods, but in character and dialogue. On the surface, the metatext of Scream is obvious in that the characters reference horror movies. One of the characters, Randy, acts as a sort of horror movie expert in the film, constantly explaining the tropes of the genre to everybody. In one scene, the main character, Sydney, is on the phone explaining why she doesn't like horror movies. She makes a comment about how dumb the people in horror movies are since they run up the stairs rather than going out the front door. But just a little bit later, Sydney tries to escape the killer by going out the door, but can't fiddle with the lock long enough to actually escape, so she ends up going up the stairs. This is the exact thing she criticized earlier. The film is self-aware of the issues with horror movies, and even though it acts as a slasher in its own right, it clarifies the logic, poking fun at older horror films while establishing itself as more sophisticated. The opening scene is chock full of metatextual and intertextual references. During the phone call, there are plenty of references to other horror movies. Towards the end, Casey is quizzed on horror movie trivia that anyone who dabbles in the horror genre could easily answer. The horror fan audience feels like if they were in this situation, that they would easily be able to answer the questions and survive. On an even more metatextual level, they cast Drew Barrymore, a massive star at the time, to play Casey Becker. From people's understanding of films and formulas, they would never expect that one of the largest stars in the movie would get killed off first. But she does, signifying to the audience that everyone in this film is able to be killed, regardless of star status or formula. The metatext in Scream and Cabin in the Woods share a common theme of criticizing the audience for enjoying horror movies. In Cabin in the Woods, they toy with this idea, with the workers celebrating with the backdrop of Dana getting brutally murdered. There's a lot of dark comedy in how Steve and Gary react to the awful events occurring.
It's so strange. I'm actually rooting for this girl. She's got so much heart. You think of all the pain and the... Tequila is my lady!
There's a character who is the new guy at the facility. He seems out of place, not celebrating with the rest of them, and criticizing their distasteful actions. Another worker tells him that he will get used to it, alluding to horror movie fans becoming desensitized to the graphic imagery. The workers in the scene act as the horror audience, using the awful events of the movies to have social gatherings where they barely pay attention to the screen. In Scream, the audience is poked fun at in the party scene where everybody is gathered around the TV to watch John Carpenter's Halloween. The teenage viewers act as stand-ins for the audience. Some of them criticize the film's camp, Stu just wants to see Jamie Lee Curtis's boobs, and Randy, the most knowledgeable about horror films and represents the target audience for the film, begins explaining the rules of the genre.
Jesus Christ, you don't know the rules? Have an aneurysm, why don't you?
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number 1, you can never have sex. Big no-no!
To any dedicated horror fan, these rules are already well known, but the explanation causes the other teenagers to joke about it because they don't take it seriously.
And number 3, never, ever, ever, under any circumstances say, I'll be right back. Because you won't be back.
I'm getting another beer. You want one?
Yeah, sure.
I'll be right back!
When they all find out that their principal has been killed and hung up on the flagpole, they excitedly and disturbingly jump up to go see it. Earlier in the film, the kids at the school jokingly dress up as Ghostface after the murders of Casey Becker. Both of these events show how disturbingly comedic the people are in the face of the murders. Since they are stand-ins for the audience, it shows, similar to Cabin in the Woods, how desensitized they've become, even to real-life atrocities. With both films criticizing the audience reactions to horror films, they both symbolize the death of old horror. John Carpenter's Halloween doesn't scare the kids anymore. They don't respect the rules of the genre. In Cabin in the Woods, the workers try to force these rules too harshly on a genre that is in desperate need of evolving. The ending of Cabin in the Woods signalizes the destruction of the horror genre, as every horror film is contained in this world. The most deadly murder in either of the films is the murder of horror itself. Just look at the horror films that came out before Scream, and then the horror movies that came out after Cabin in the Woods. The two films simultaneously killed, but also revitalized the genre into one of the most breathtaking and beautiful genres of the 2010s.